He offered $1 million to anyone who could ride his wild horse, but no one expected a 13-year-old girl to step forward. The richest man in Montana thought he could buy fear, pride, even mercy, with one outrageous bet. But when a barefoot girl walked into his dusty ranch and whispered to the wildest horse in the state, something in that man, and in everyone watching, began to change forever. The afternoon light fell over Ash Hollow like dust made of gold. The wind carried the dry smell of sage and rust, whistling through the broken fences of the Cormack Ranch. Inside the corral, a black horse kicked against the iron gate, its hooves striking sparks from the dirt floor. The chains clanged with each desperate movement, the sound echoing through the valley like a cry too old to care anymore. Hank Cormack stood outside the gate, boots planted wide, a cigar pinched between his fingers. His hat shadowed half his face, but his jawline was sharp and proud, carved from years of stubborn victories. Around him, the ranch hands watched with that mix of fear and fascination they always felt around their boss. "He's no use," Hank said. "Sell him to the rodeo boys. Let them make a show of him before he kills somebody." The horse reared, screaming, a sound that wasn't anger so much as heartbreak. A clump of dust rose like smoke around its legs. Hank's lips curved into a grin. "Hell, I'll make it interesting," he added. $1 million to anyone who can ride that beast." Laughter rippled through the ranch yard. Men slapped each other's backs, shaking their heads. The number was absurd, just like the man who said it. Hank's money was as much a myth as his temper, and no one alive dared test either. But someone was watching. From behind the fence posts, half hidden in the golden grass, a thin girl stood barefoot, clutching a tin pail half full of water. Her name was Grace Miller, the orphan who lived with her aunt at the edge of town. Every morning she came to the ranch to feed the dogs that no one claimed and to help Nora Jenkins, the local veterinarian, clean the stalls. She watched the horse with eyes too old for 13. The sunlight caught her face, the freckles, the raw sincerity in her expression. The animal's eyes, wild and rolling white, caught hers for just a heartbeat. In that instant, something in her chest tightened, like a wire pulled too hard. "That thing's a devil," muttered one of the workers, spitting into the dirt. "You can see it in his eyes." But Grace didn't move. She didn't blink. When the men left, she approached the fence slowly, the dust rising around her ankles. The horse was still breathing hard, its sides heaving, foam streaking its black coat. The metal bit between its teeth was stained dark with old blood. Grace set the pail down. The sound of it touching earth made the horse flinch. "It's okay," she whispered, her voice trembling like a leaf. "You don't have to fight." The horse turned, snorting, chains rattling. Its breath came out in a rough shudder, warm and full of fear. Grace stayed still. Her heart pounded so loud she thought he could hear it. A moment passed, then another. Behind her, heavy footsteps approached. Nora's voice broke the silence. "Grace, what are you doing?" The woman's tone was sharp, but her eyes betrayed concern. "You shouldn't be near him. That horse has hurt 2 men already." Grace nodded without turning. "He's not mean," she said softly. "He's just scared." Nora sighed, running a hand through her gray-streaked hair. "Scared or not, that animal's trouble. Go home, child, before Hank catches you." But Grace didn't move. She watched the chains glint in the sunlight, saw how each tug left a raw mark on the horse's legs. A slow, cold anger bloomed inside her, not the loud kind, but the kind that burned quietly and never went out. She didn't say another word. She picked up the pail and walked away, her bare feet leaving faint prints in the dust. Behind her, Hank's laughter still echoed across the fields. $1 million, he had said. The men had laughed because they thought it was a joke. But Grace carried those words with her like a thorn lodged deep in her skin. That night, she couldn't sleep. The wind rattled the thin windows of her aunt's house, and through the open door of her small room she could hear the distant cry of coyotes. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying the image of the horse chained to the post. His eyes weren't wild. They were pleading. When dawn came, she got up before anyone else. The horizon was painted with streaks of amber and gray. She slipped on her father's old flannel shirt, rolled up the sleeves, and walked back to the ranch. The grass was wet with dew, brushing against her ankles. The corral was quiet. The horse stood still, head lowered, steam rising from its nostrils. Grace climbed the fence slowly, her palms gripping the cool wood. She could see the lines of old scars beneath his coat, faint and pale against the black. Her chest tightened again. "I know you're tired," she said softly. "I would be too." The horse twitched an ear, but didn't move away. Grace reached into her pocket and pulled out a bruised apple she'd saved from yesterday's lunch. She tossed it lightly over the fence. It rolled near his hoof. The horse hesitated, then bent its head, nostrils flaring, and took a bite. The crunching sound made her smile, small but real. From the barn, Hank's voice rang out again, rough as gravel. "That you, Miller girl?" Grace froze. Hank appeared in the doorway, his broad silhouette framed by the light. "You feeding my $1 million demon?" She swallowed hard. "He's not a demon, sir." Hank chuckled, stepping closer. "You think you can do better than my men?" Grace shook her head. "No. I just think he deserves better." For a moment, the air between them went still. Hank studied her face, the dirt on her cheeks, the steadiness in her eyes. Then he laughed again, a sound without warmth. "You've got spirit, I'll give you that. But spirit gets you killed around here." He turned to leave, muttering something about fools and girls with soft hearts. The door slammed behind him, leaving Grace alone with the dust and the steady sound of the horse chewing. She stayed a while longer, leaning against the fence, feeling the warmth of the animal's breath from afar. Somewhere deep inside her, a thought began to take root. Reckless, impossible, but alive. If no one else would stand for him, maybe she would. The horse lifted its head, eyes catching the light, and for a fleeting second she thought she saw trust. Or maybe hope. When she finally left the ranch, the sun was high, the air hot and humming. Behind her, the chains rattled again, softer this time, almost like a whisper. Grace didn't look back, but she already knew. The next time she returned, it wouldn't be just to feed him, it would be to change everything. Morning in Ash Hollow always smelled of iron and dust. The sky was wide and pale, like it had been scrubbed too clean. Down by Main Street, the gossip was louder than the church bells. The ranch hands had told everyone what Hank said the day before, that he'd pay $1 million to anyone brave or foolish enough to ride his wild horse. At the diner, old men chuckled into their coffee. $1 million, one of them said. He'd sooner give away his ranch. Their laughter carried out the open door and across the street, where Grace Miller walked with her head down, a worn canvas bag swinging at her side. She didn't laugh. The number didn't sound like money to her. It sounded like a chain, heavy and cold. Every time someone said the horse, she felt a knot tighten inside her chest. At the edge of town, she stopped at the small wooden shed that served as Nora Jenkins's veterinary office. The woman was already there, sleeves rolled up, cleaning a wound on a stray dog. The air smelled of iodine and hay. "You're up early?" Nora said without looking up. "Couldn't sleep?" Grace hesitated, then shook her head. "I went to see him again." The clatter of metal instruments stopped. Nora turned. "Grace, we talked about this. That horse is not safe. Hank should have had him put down a long time ago." Grace stood by the door, sunlight catching the dust in her hair. "He's not angry, Miss Nora. He's hurt. You can see it in his eyes." Nora sighed. She had seen that look before, the stubborn light of a child who had already decided to believe in something. "You can't save every broken thing, sweetheart," she said gently. Grace's hands tightened around the strap of her bag. "Then I'll save this one." The woman didn't answer. She only shook her head, the corners of her mouth soft with pity. Grace left the clinic without another word. The road to the ranch stretched like a line drawn in chalk across the plain. The wind pressed against her clothes, lifting the hem of her shirt as if trying to hold her back. By the time she reached the corral, the men were already there. Hank stood at the center, looking like a man who had never once doubted himself. "You boys hear that?" he said, flicking ash from his cigar. $1 million. That's more than any of you'll see in 3 lifetimes. Who's got the guts?" The crowd murmured. No one stepped forward. They all looked at the horse, at the black muscles rippling under its skin, the flared nostrils, the foam on its lips. It was beautiful in the way wildfires are beautiful, the kind of beauty that burned you just for looking too long. Grace stood at the back of the group, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. Hank's laughter rolled through the air. "Didn't think so," he said, turning away. "Big talk, small men." Something inside her snapped. The sound of his voice, the way everyone stared at the ground, the way no one saw the animal trembling in pain instead of rage. It all came together in one fierce, quiet thought. "If they won't, I will." She stepped forward. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. "Mr. Cormack." The men turned. Hank squinted at her, amused. "Well, if it isn't the Miller girl. What do you want, sweetheart? A job sweeping the stables?" "I'll ride him." For a moment, the air itself seemed to stop. Then laughter broke like glass. Someone whistled. Another man muttered something crude under his breath. Hank removed his hat and wiped the sweat from his brow. "You?" he said, half laughing. "You can barely reach the saddle." Grace lifted her chin. "You said anyone. $1 million to anyone who rides him. I'm anyone." The laughter faded. Even Hank seemed unsure whether she was joking. "You'd get yourself killed, girl." "I'm not doing it for the money," she said. "I'm doing it so you'll let him live." That shut him up. He stared at her for a long time, the wind ruffling the brim of his hat. "You'd risk your life for a horse?" "Yes." The word came out like a prayer. She didn't add what she wanted to. That she'd rather die doing something kind than keep walking past cruelty like it was normal. The ranch yard was silent now. Even the men who'd been laughing before looked uneasy. One of them whispered, "She's serious." Another spat into the dirt. "Crazy kid." Hank's grin returned, though softer this time, almost tired. "Fine. If you're so set on dying young, I'll make you a deal. You stay on that horse for 1 full minute. You get your wish. The million's yours, and he walks free." Grace swallowed hard. "And if I fall?" Then you'll learn why we don't pet wild things. He held out his hand. His palm was rough, scarred, from years of ropes and reins. Grace stared at it for a heartbeat, then placed her smaller hand in his. His grip was like steel. "You've got 7 days," he said. "Then we see what you're really made of." She nodded once, not trusting herself to speak. The men went back to their work, shaking their heads, whispering that the boss had finally lost his mind. Hank watched her walk away, her braid swinging behind her, and something like curiosity crossed his face. That night, the sky over Ash Hollow burned orange at the edges. The fields shimmered in the dying light, and Grace sat on the porch of her aunt's house, staring out toward the ranch. Her hands were still trembling from where Hank had gripped them. She could hear her aunt's voice through the window, scolding her for spending so much time with the animals, saying she should start acting like a proper girl. But Grace barely listened. She could still see the horse's eyes, not wild, but wounded, the way people look when they've been beaten into silence. In her lap lay her father's old pocket knife, its handle worn smooth. She turned it over in her hands, then carved 4 small words into the porch rail. "He deserves to live." The next morning, she walked back to the ranch. Nora was waiting for her at the gate, her expression tight. "What did you do?" Grace didn't stop walking. "I made a deal." Nora grabbed her arm. "With Hank? You can't be serious." "I am." "Grace, he's not playing a game. That man will let you die before he loses face." Grace pulled free, her voice low but fierce. "Then he'll have to watch." The vet stared at her, seeing something in the girl's eyes that made her chest ache. Not rebellion, but resolve. "You'll need help," she said finally. "I'll need time," Grace replied. 7 days. The two of them stood there as the wind kicked up dust around their feet. In the distance, the black horse reared against his chains, the sun flashing off his coat like glass. Grace's voice was barely more than a whisper, but it carried through the dry air like a promise. "He won't be wild when I'm done. He'll be free." Nora exhaled slowly. "Then God help you both." Neither of them noticed Hank watching from the barn door, a shadow against the light. His cigar burned low, the smoke curling like a question in the air. He smiled, not kindly, not cruelly, just the smile of a man who'd seen too many people fail. 7 days, he murmured. Let's see if the little girl still doesn't laugh when it's over. The midday heat in Montana had a weight to it, a dry, pressing silence that made even the grass bend in surrender. The sun was a burning coin above the Cormac Ranch, and the dust shimmered like glass shards in the light. Hank Cormac stood in the center of the yard, his hat pulled low, his boots sunk half an inch into the earth. The men were gathering again, their faces slick, with sweat, waiting for something to talk about. And they got it. Grace Miller walked straight across the yard like a shadow that refused to disappear. Her boots were too big, her sleeves rolled up, her braid coming undone. Nora Jenkins trailed behind her, calling her name, but Grace didn't turn back. She stopped 5 feet away from Hank, chin high, eyes unflinching. "I'm not changing my mind," she said. Hank tilted his head, squinting through the glare. "I figured as much." "I want it in writing," Grace continued. "If I stay on that horse for 1 minute, you'll let him live. No rodeo, no bullets, no selling him to the slaughter yards." The word slaughter hung in the air, heavier than the heat. A couple of men looked away, muttering. Hank's smile barely moved. "You think I'd go back on my word, little girl?" "I think you go back on a lot of things," she answered. That caught him. His smirk twitched, then returned. He pulled a handkerchief from his pocket and wiped the sweat from his neck. Fine. You want it in writing? You got it. He turned to one of his men. Tom, bring me a paper and pen. The man disappeared into the barn and came back with an old clipboard, a sheet of lined paper trembling in the wind. Hank wrote quickly, his hand steady. If Grace Miller rides my black Mustang for 1 full minute, she will receive $1 million and full custody of the animal. He signed his name with a flourish, the ink pooling slightly under the sun. He handed it to her. Happy? Grace read it twice. Her thumb left a smudge of dust on the corner of the paper. Almost, she said. You forgot one thing. Oh? If I fall, she said quietly, promise me you'll treat him like he mattered. The ranch went still. A hawk cried somewhere above them, circling in slow loops against the white sky. Hank looked at her for a long time before nodding once. You've got 7 days, he said. After that, the deal's off. Nora stepped forward, voice trembling with both anger and fear. You can't do this, Hank. She's a child. Hank's voice was calm, almost cold. She's the one asking for it. He turned to Grace. You're serious about this? Grace met his gaze. More serious than you've ever been about anything. The men started whispering again, but Hank's raised hand silenced them. Then it settled. He looked at Nora, a trace of mockery in his tone. You're her friend, Doc? You make sure she lives long enough to regret this. Nora's jaw tightened. You're disgusting. He only smiled. Takes one to know one. The crowd broke apart, leaving Grace standing in the middle of the yard with the contract folded in her hand. Nora grabbed her by the shoulders. Grace, listen to me. You can't ride that thing. You saw what he did to the last man. Grace shook her head. I'm not trying to ride him the way they did. I just need him to. No, I'm not like them. Knowing won't keep you alive, Nora snapped. Grace's voice was soft, but there was something fierce beneath it. It might keep him alive. Nora had no answer for that. She looked at the child in front of her, dirt on her cheeks, a cut on her lip, her eyes calm as stone. And she realized there was no stopping her. That evening, the contract sat on Nora's desk under a paperweight, the ink drying to a faded gray. She stared at it for a long time, while the sun slipped behind the hills, turning everything the color of fire. Grace sat outside the barn, her knees drawn to her chest. The horse was a dark blur behind the fence, restless, its breath fogging the cooling air. They call you a demon, she whispered. Guess they said that about a lot of things they didn't understand. The horse turned its head, one ear flicking toward her voice. Grace smiled faintly. We've got 7 days, you and me. The next morning, the whole town knew. Someone had posted a copy of the contract on the door of the diner. The words $1 million bet were circled in red pen. By noon, people from the neighboring counties had started driving in. Farmers, drifters, rodeo men, reporters. A storm of curiosity had arrived before the real one. Hank didn't mind. He liked the attention. Free advertising, he said to his foreman. Every fool in Montana's talking about the Cormac Ranch again. Couldn't buy better publicity. He used that same line later when a reporter from Billings asked about the child. She's no different from anyone else. The world rewards the brave. When Nora heard that quote on the local radio, she threw the nearest wrench at the wall. Grace, sitting in the corner of the clinic, didn't flinch. She was tracing the edge of the contract with one finger, memorizing every curve of Hank's signature. "He won't believe until he sees it," she said. "What?" Nora asked. "The difference between fighting and listening." That night, Grace returned to the corral. The air smelled of rain, though the sky was still dry. She climbed the fence quietly and sat on the top rail. The horse was pacing, restless, its hooves leaving deep grooves in the dirt. When it saw her, it stopped, ears twitching. "I made a deal," she whispered. "Not with him, with you. If you let me understand, I'll never hurt you." The horse snorted, shaking its mane. A single droplet of rain hit her hand, then another. Within minutes, the air broke open, thunder rolling, wind snapping the flags on the fence posts. Grace climbed down, standing barefoot in the mud. The storm drenched her in seconds. The horse reared, lightning slicing the sky behind it. She raised her voice over the thunder. "You don't have to be afraid anymore." The horse stopped for half a second, breathing hard, steam rising from its nostrils in the cold rain. Then, for the first time, it didn't lunge. It simply stood there, watching her. When the storm passed, the world smelled of wet earth and new beginnings. Grace's hair clung to her face, her clothes plastered to her skin. She was shaking, from cold, from fear, from something else entirely. Behind her, Hank's truck headlights flashed once, cutting through the fog. He had been watching the whole time, parked on the ridge. He muttered to himself, almost impressed. "Damn fool girl." Then he smiled faintly, the kind of smile a man wears when he can't tell if he's witnessing courage or madness. The next morning, Grace woke to the smell of coffee and hay. Nora was at the table, newspaper in hand. The headline read, "Rancher's $1 million bet becomes local spectacle." Below it, a blurry photo showed Grace in the rain, hair plastered, eyes wide. Someone must have taken it from the road. Grace frowned. "They think it's a show." Nora looked at her over the rim of her mug. "Let them. Maybe they'll see something worth watching." Outside, the horse neighed, a deep, rolling sound that carried across the field. Grace set her cup down. He's waiting. And for the first time since her father's funeral, she smiled. Not from joy, but from knowing exactly what she had to do. Morning came gray and heavy, the kind that carried no warmth, only promise of dust. The Cormac Ranch felt quieter than usual. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Hank had kept his word. The girl was allowed 1 hour a day with the horse, under Nora's watch, and the eyes of 2 ranch hands who treated it like a circus rehearsal. Grace walked toward the corral with a notebook pressed to her chest. Her aunt's warnings still rang in her ears, words about foolishness and pride. But her heart beat steady, the way a drum might sound before a long march. The black Mustang, Midnight, as she had begun calling him, stood at the far end of the pen, muscles tight, eyes glinting beneath his tangled forelock. The chains were gone now, replaced by a long lead line that gave him room to move but not to escape. She set her notebook on the fence and spoke softly. "It's just me," no one answered, but the horse's ears flicked toward her. Grace didn't approach. Instead, she sat down in the dirt, legs crossed, pencil in hand. She wrote, "Day 1. Watches from distance, moves away from every sound, breathing shallow, pain in left hind leg." The ranch hands snickered behind her. "Writing him a love letter?" one said. She ignored them. Nora was leaning on the fence nearby, her expression unreadable, a cigarette burning low between her fingers. The first hour passed in quiet rhythm, Grace's pencil moving, the horse shifting restlessly, dust spiraling in the heat. When Hank came by to inspect, he chuckled under his breath. "You plan to bore him into submission?" Grace didn't answer. She closed her notebook and said simply, "See you tomorrow." By the third day, her silence had become part of the landscape. The men stopped laughing. Even Hank seemed mildly curious. Grace had learned the rhythm of Midnight's breathing, the way his flank twitched when flies landed on his scarred skin. She could tell when he'd reach his breaking point, when he'd back into the far corner to escape unseen ghosts. She started talking to him in low tones, the way her father once spoke to machines he was fixing. "You've got a bad leg," she said one morning, crouching near the fence. "Hurts when you twist." "I see it." The horse tossed his head but didn't move away. Grace wrote again. "Flinches less when spoken to softly. Still won't eat from hand. Not angry, wary." Nora approached quietly. "You're studying him like a vet." "I just want to understand," Grace said. "Understanding's not the same as saving." Grace smiled faintly. "Maybe it's the first step." That evening, when she left the corral, Hank was waiting by his truck. The smoke from his cigar curled around him like a veil. "You think kindness tames a beast, girl?" "No," Grace said, her voice calm. "But fear doesn't either." He chuckled, a low sound that didn't reach his eyes. "You sound like your father. He worked for me once, too gentle for his own good." Grace froze. "You knew my father?" "Everybody knew Joe Miller," Hank said. "He tried to gentle a horse for me years back, broke his arm and quit, said some things can't be forced." He flicked the ash onto the dirt. "He was wrong." Grace didn't reply. She just watched him drive away, the sound of his engine fading into the dry air. She'd never told anyone, but her father had died trying to rescue a trapped horse during a flood. Hearing Hank twist that memory made something cold bloom inside her chest. On the fourth day, a change began. Grace sat closer, only a few yards now, her notebook forgotten. Midnight's breathing had slowed, his ears twitching less. The sound of her voice, even in whispers, no longer sent him spinning. "He's starting to trust you," Nora murmured. Grace nodded. "He's starting to listen." But Hank didn't see progress. He saw weakness. When he visited that afternoon, he whistled sharply to test the horse's reaction. Midnight flinched so hard he almost toppled. Grace stood up fast, fury flaring across her face. "Don't," she said. Hank raised an eyebrow. "Don't what? You can't protect him from sound." Her fists tightened. "I can protect him from cruelty." For a second, Hank seemed amused. Then something darker crossed his eyes. "Careful, girl. The world doesn't reward soft hearts." "Then maybe it's the world that's wrong," she whispered. He left without another word. The wind came back then, carrying with it a smell of rain and something electric. The sky cracked open with distant thunder. By the sixth day, the whole town had heard that Grace Miller was taming Hank's horse with silence and a notebook. Some came to watch. Farmers leaning on the fence, women whispering behind gloved hands. Reporters began to sniff around, eager for a story that mixed danger with innocence. Grace ignored them all. She sat in the dirt again, closer than ever before. Midnight stood still, chest heaving, nostrils flaring as if weighing the distance between them. "I'm not here to win," she said. "Just to understand." Slowly, she extended her hand. The horse snorted, his body tensing, but he didn't back away. Her fingers hovered inches from his neck. She could feel the warmth radiating off him, the tremor under his skin. When her fingertips finally brushed his coat, it was like touching fire, a connection fragile as glass. He didn't strike. He didn't flee. Grace exhaled, a shaky, soundless breath. For the first time, the ranch yard was quiet enough that she could hear the crickets start their song. Nora's cigarette burned out between her fingers as she watched, wordless. That evening, Grace sat outside the corral long after the others had gone. Midnight grazed a few feet away, the sun setting behind him like a bruise of orange and purple. The air smelled of hay and dust. "I think we're both learning," she said softly. "You, to trust. Me, to wait." The horse lifted his head and looked at her. Not the wide-eyed panic from before, but a calm, assessing gaze. She smiled, small and tired. Behind her, a voice cut through the stillness. "You really think this means something?" Hank again. She turned, the sunset burning behind him. "Yes," she said simply. He studied her for a long time. "You sound sure." "I am." He lit another cigar, the flame flickering between them. "Tomorrow's the last day. I hope your faith keeps you on that saddle." Grace didn't answer. She didn't need to. The next day would prove whether silence could outlast violence. As Hank walked away, his shadow stretched long over the corral, dividing the girl from the horse like a line drawn by fate itself. That night, lightning flashed far out over the plains. Grace sat by her window, watching the storm gather. She thought of her father, of the way he used to hum when he worked, of the horse breathing beside her today. She wrote in her notebook before bed, "He doesn't need to be broken. Neither do I." The storm never reached the ranch, but the thunder stayed in the air, waiting. The sixth morning came wrapped in silence. A heavy sky hung over Ash Hollow, swollen with clouds that hadn't yet decided whether to break. The fields shimmered faintly with heat, and the smell of iron drifted through the air, a warning more than a scent. Grace Miller walked toward the corral barefoot, her notebook pressed against her ribs. Every step felt heavier, though she couldn't say why. Something about the light, or the stillness, or the way even the birds had stopped singing, made her think the world was holding its breath. Nora. Jenkins followed a few paces behind, a mug of coffee trembling slightly in her hand. "You don't have to go today," she said. Grace kept walking. "He'll be waiting." Inside the pen, the black Mustang stood restless, pawing at the dirt. The lead rope was gone now. Hank had ordered it removed, saying if the girl wanted a fair chance, the animal should have freedom enough to choose what it did. The words had sounded generous at first, but Grace knew the truth. Hank wanted a show. He wanted fear. When she reached the fence, she stopped. Her hands trembled, not from terror, but anticipation. For days, she'd been learning his rhythm, his quiet language. Today, she could feel something was off. The horse's muscles bunched beneath his coat, his nostrils flaring, his tail whipping like a flag in the wind. "What did they do to him?" she asked. Nora glanced toward the barn, where the ranch foreman, a broad man named Tucker, leaned on a post, smirking. "Probably kept him awake half the night," she muttered. "Hank told them to make him ready." "Ready for what?" For the camera crews, Nora said bitterly. Grace turned, eyes narrowing. He's in pain. Grace! But she was already climbing the fence. The men shouted for her to get down, but she ignored them. She dropped into the corral, the dirt soft beneath her bare feet. The horse snapped his head toward her, ears flat. His breath came out in short bursts. The whites of his eyes gleamed. Grace stayed still. It's me. A moment passed. The kind of fragile pause that could either become trust or disaster. She took one slow step forward, then another. The horse stomped once, snorting. Mud sprayed across her jeans. Easy, she whispered. She saw it then, the wound. A raw, red mark along the animal's flank, half hidden beneath dried sweat. Her stomach twisted. They hit you, didn't they? Behind her, Tucker's laugh rang out. You think you can fix that with sweet talk, girl? She turned, anger flashing across her face. You don't fix fear by feeding it more pain. The foreman spat into the dust. You talk too much for a kid. A rumble rolled across the sky. Thunder. The first drops of rain began to fall, large and warm. Nora ran toward the fence. Grace, get out of there. It's not safe. But Grace didn't move. The rain came harder, washing streaks of dirt down her arms. Midnight reared, hooves slicing the air. For a heartbeat, it looked like he would crush her. Nora screamed her name. Grace didn't flinch. She closed her eyes and whispered something. Not a prayer, not a plea, just a sound that barely had shape. It's all right. I see you. The horse froze mid-motion. Its body shook, muscles quivering, and then it came down again, breathing hard, nostrils flaring close enough that she could feel the heat. Lightning split the horizon, throwing the world into white. For a moment, it was just the two. Of them in that flash, the child and the creature everyone feared, their silhouettes locked in fragile balance. When the thunder followed, it broke like a shout. The horse bolted past her, circling wildly. Grace fell to one knee, mud splashing her face. Nora started toward the gate, but Grace lifted her hand. No! She pushed herself up, the rain pounding so hard it blurred her vision. She followed the horse's frantic path, keeping her distance but not giving up ground. The mud sucked at her feet, her hair plastered against her skin. Easy, she cried. I won't hurt you. The horse slowed, panting. Its legs trembled from exhaustion, its body streaked with water and blood from reopened scars. Grace stepped closer, whispering through her breath. You're not alone. Not anymore. At last, midnight stopped. The rain softened into drizzle. The horse stood, sides heaving, eyes glassy but calm. Grace reached out, fingers trembling, and touched the wound on his flank. He flinched, but didn't move away. She tore a strip from the hem of her shirt and gently wiped away the mud and blood. From the fence, Nora watched in silence, one hand pressed against her chest. Tucker muttered a curse and walked off, muttering that the girl must have some kind of witchcraft in her. Grace didn't hear. She was lost in the sound of the horse's breathing. Slow now, even. When she finally looked up, Hank was standing in the rain near the gate, cigar extinguished, his expression unreadable. You're gonna get yourself killed, he said. Grace wiped the water from her face. Maybe, but if I do, it won't be for nothing. Hank's jaw tightened. You think pity saves anything? No, she said, but understanding does. He turned without replying, the rain darkening his hat brim. As he walked away, the sound of his boots on the wet ground echoed longer than it should have. Grace stayed until the clouds broke open and a faint stripe of sunlight touched the mud. Midnight lowered his head and brushed her shoulder with his muzzle, tentative, questioning. She froze, then smiled through her tears. "Thank you," she whispered. By the time she left the corral, the sky had turned gold again, the kind of gold that feels like an ending and a beginning at once. Nora handed her a towel. "You scared 10 years off my life," she said quietly. Grace managed a small laugh. "Guess we both needed the storm." That night, she couldn't sleep. Her hands still smelled of the rain and the horse's sweat. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw those scars. Not just the ones on his body, but the ones he carried in his eyes. In her notebook, under the date, she wrote, "Pain teaches fear. Kindness teaches memory." The following morning, the sun rose behind the hills, pale and weak. Grace walked out to the corral again. Midnight lifted his head the moment he heard her steps. His ears turned forward, his gaze steady. She smiled. "Good morning," she said. "We made it." Nora watched from a distance, her coffee growing cold. There was something in the air, the hush that comes after a storm, when even the land seems to breathe easier. For the first time, the Mustang stepped toward Grace on his own. Not much, just 2 small steps, but enough to make her breath catch. The wound had started to crust over, dark and dry. The clouds were gone, leaving behind a sky so blue it almost hurt to look at. Grace placed her hand against the wooden post and whispered to the empty air, "He's not wild. He's just been hurt too many times." From his porch, Hank watched, arms crossed, eyes narrowed. The girl's stubbornness irritated him, but something in her calmness made him uneasy. He could almost hear his younger self in her voice, the part of him that once believed in gentler things. He ground out his cigar and muttered under his breath, "Foolish girl," though the word foolish sounded like envy. Later, Nora found Grace sitting under the oak tree near the fence, scribbling again. "What are you writing this time?" Grace smiled without looking up. "His story." Nora raised an eyebrow. "You think people will read it?" "Maybe not," Grace said, "but maybe he'll feel it." The wind picked up, carrying the scent of hay and rain. For a moment both of them looked toward the field, where the horse was standing under the sunlight, eyes half closed, peaceful. Nora said quietly, "He's starting to look free." Grace shook her head. "Not yet, but soon." Behind them, thunder murmured again on the horizon, a low echo like a heartbeat. The week wasn't over, and neither was the storm that had begun inside every person who'd seen that moment, the ranch hands, the doctor, even Hank himself. None of them would say it aloud, but they all knew. Something had shifted. The morning of the 7th day came like the first breath after drowning. Quiet, stretched, thin, trembling with what everyone knew was coming. A pale sun rose over Ash Hollow, turning the fields gold. The smell of dust, hay, and sweat hung in the air, thick as prayer. Every soul within 10 miles of the Cormac Ranch had shown up, drawn by something between curiosity and hunger. Pickup trucks lined the fence, cameras glinted in the light. A banner someone had made out of tarp flapped in the breeze. The $1 Million Ride. Hank stood on the platform he'd built for himself, hat low, arms folded, a man pretending not to care about the spectacle he'd created. "1 minute," he told the crowd, his voice rolling across the yard. "All she has to do is stay on 1 minute." His grin was hard. And if she can't, well, that'll be a lesson worth watching. Grace Miller waited at the edge of the corral, barefoot, her braid damp from the morning dew. Nora Jenkins tightened the strap on her borrowed helmet, though Grace kept saying she didn't need it. "Humor me," Nora insisted. "You're about to make half the state of Montana forget how to breathe." Grace smiled weakly. Then maybe they'll finally listen for once. The horse, Midnight, was already inside the ring. His coat gleamed wet black under the sun, muscles tight as wire. He snorted, hooves stamping at the dirt, nostrils flaring like smoke. The crowd gasped as he reared, a thunder of hooves and air. Nora caught Grace's wrist before she could climb the fence. "If it gets bad, if he turns, you run. You understand?" Grace looked at her, eyes calm, clear as water. "He won't turn. Not on me." The gate opened with a metallic groan. The murmurs died down. Grace stepped inside. The sound of her feet crunching on gravel echoed louder than the murmurs of the crowd. She stopped a few feet from Midnight. The horse's head lifted. Every muscle in his body coiled tight. Grace spoke softly, barely moving her lips. "I'm not here to win anything." Hank leaned against the railing, muttering to his foreman, "Watch this. She'll last 5 seconds." Grace reached for the halter lying on the fence, but instead of forcing it on, she let it fall to the ground. "No chains today," she whispered. "No pain." The crowd stirred. Someone yelled, "Put the halter on! You'll never get near him!" Grace ignored them. The horse took a half step back, his tail flicking. Dust rose between them like smoke from an invisible fire. She extended her hand, palm up. It was the same motion she'd practiced every morning for 7 days. Small, slow, deliberate. The air trembled between her hand and his muzzle. The horse's breath reached her skin, warm and shaking. Then, against everything Hank and his men had believed possible, Midnight didn't strike. He sniffed her fingers, then dropped his head an inch, eyes softening. Gasps spread through the crowd like wind through wheat. Cameras clicked. Someone whispered, "Holy hell." Grace swallowed, heart pounding. "It's okay," she said. "You don't have to fight." She moved closer until she could feel his breath on her face. Then, gently, she placed her hand on his neck. His muscles twitched, but he didn't move. She leaned her forehead against him. The world seemed to fall away. The noise, the dust, the crowd. It was only them. And then she climbed. Slowly, carefully, she slid her small foot into the stirrup, gripping the edge of his mane. Her whole body trembled. For one long moment, she hovered there, between earth and sky, between belief and fear. Midnight shuddered. Hank's cigar froze halfway to his lips. Nora stopped breathing. Then Grace swung her leg over and sat. The horse danced sideways, a quick jolt of confusion. The crowd gasped again. But Grace didn't grab the reins, didn't squeeze her knees to command him. She simply sat, back straight, hands open at her sides. Midnight turned his head slightly, as if checking whether she was real. Then he started to move, slow. First, then faster, circling the ring once, twice. Grace leaned forward, her body moving with his rhythm, not against it. Her eyes were closed. When the minute passed, no one counted. They'd forgotten about time. The silence stretched until even the air stopped stirring. Hank finally barked, "That's enough!" But his voice cracked, the sound hollow. Grace slid off, landing light as dust. She stood before the horse, hand resting on his chest. Midnight snorted once, lowering his head until his muzzle brushed her shoulder. The crowd erupted. Applause, cheers, disbelief. But Grace didn't raise her arms. She only whispered something to the animal that no one else could hear. From where he stood, Hank felt his throat tighten. He'd seen 1,000 riders, 1,000 shows. None had looked like this. No shouting, no struggle, no victory pose. Just peace. The foreman muttered, "Guess she did it." Hank didn't answer. His cigar had gone out in his hand. Nora rushed to Grace, tears running freely. "You did it, honey. You did it." Grace shook her head. "No," she said softly. "We did it." Midnight turned toward the open gate, waiting. The girl glanced back once at Hank. "You said 1 minute," she reminded him. "I think we gave each other more than that." Hank stared at her, jaw working, but no words came. Finally, he nodded once. "The deal stands," he said hoarsely. "You've earned it." Grace smiled, a small, tired smile that made her look older than her years. "It wasn't about earning anything," she said. As she walked out of the corral, the cameras followed her. Reporters shouted questions. How did she do it? What would she do with the money? Was she afraid? But she didn't answer. Nora put an arm around her shoulders. "You know what they'll call you now?" Grace looked up. "What?" "The girl who silenced 1,000,000 voices." That night, when the noise of celebration faded and the last trucks left, Hank stayed behind. He stood by the empty corral, staring at the marks in the dirt where the horse had circled. His reflection shimmered faintly in a puddle, distorted and small. He whispered to no one. She didn't tame him. She forgave him. Inside the barn, Midnight stood free for the first time without a chain or rope. Grace came by with a blanket and a handful of hay. She didn't speak. The horse lifted his head and stepped toward her, the sound of his hooves soft and deliberate. She laid the blanket over his back, her fingers brushing the scar that still traced his side. "I told you," she said quietly. "No more pain." He leaned his muzzle against her shoulder, and for a moment she forgot the crowd, the money, the cameras. The world shrank to the warmth of his breath and the steady rhythm of two hearts, finally at peace. The next morning, the newspapers printed the headline, "The $1,000,000 Girl Rides Without Fear." Below it, a photo captured the moment she sat bareback, eyes closed, hand on the horse's neck. But none of them caught the truth of it, that what really happened that day wasn't a victory or a miracle. It was surrender, quiet and full of grace. And for the first time in years, Hank Cormack couldn't bring himself to light a cigar. Night fell slowly over Ash Hollow, the kind of darkness that comes not with fear, but with exhaustion. The crowd was gone, the cameras packed, and the corral stood empty except for the fading prints of hooves in the dust. The echo of applause still clung to the wooden fences, but the land itself seemed hushed, like it was waiting for something sacred to settle. Inside the ranch house, the lights were low. Hank Cormack sat at his desk, the same desk where, days earlier, he had written that ridiculous contract, the promise of $1,000,000 and a life spared. The paper now lay in front of him, the ink smudged by his own damp thumb. He hadn't realized until tonight that his hands shook when he tried to light a cigar. He didn't smoke. He just sat there, staring out the window at the faint shape of the corral, remembering how that girl, barefoot, stubborn, fragile-looking, had walked in and done what no man in 50 years had managed. She hadn't conquered the horse. She'd understood it. The memory refused to leave him. He saw again the moment when midnight, that black storm of muscle and fear, had lowered his head to her touch. There had been no whip, no yelling, no spectacle, just silence and trust. Hank leaned back in his chair, eyes closing. The ranch was quiet now, but his mind was loud. So loud with voices he hadn't heard in years. His father, yelling orders, the crowds at the rodeos, cheering his name when he was younger. And beneath it all, a single soft voice that had haunted him since his 20s. His son's. He hadn't thought of the boy in years. 15 when he left, angry, saying he didn't want to live in a place that chained animals to prove a man's worth. Hank had told him not to come back until he'd grown a spine. That was 20 years ago. The boy never returned. He stared at his reflection in the window, a man grayer, heavier, smaller than the myth he'd spent his life building. For the first time, he wondered if his son had been right. The door creaked open behind him. Nora Jenkins stepped in quietly, her hat in her hand. "You look like a man who's seen a ghost," she said. "Maybe I have." Nora didn't sit. "She's with the horse," she said softly. He's calm, eating hay from her hand like he's known her forever. Hank nodded. "Figures. You proud of her?" He almost smiled, but it faded. "Pride's not the word. I don't know what to call it." Nora looked at him for a long time. "Maybe it's something you haven't felt in a while." He gave a low laugh. "You mean shame?" "Maybe that too." The silence stretched between them. Outside, the wind shifted, rattling the shutters. Finally, Hank said, "You think that horse forgave me?" Nora's eyes softened. "Animals don't forgive or hate, Hank. They remember. You can't change the past, but you can make sure it doesn't keep repeating." He nodded, his gaze distant. "That girl, she reminds me of someone. Not her face, the way she believes in things. My son used to talk like that, before I turned him mean." Nora didn't respond. There was nothing to say. Some wounds were too old for words. The next morning, the ranch was a different place. The reporters had left, the roads were empty, but something invisible had shifted. The workers spoke quietly. The usual laughter and gossip were gone. When Hank came out to the yard, no one met his eyes. Grace was sitting by the corral, her notebook on her knees. Midnight grazed nearby, free of ropes and chains. The air was cool, touched with early autumn. Hank walked toward her, his boots crunching on gravel. "Morning." Grace looked up, her eyes clear and tired. "Morning, Mr. Cormack." He hesitated. "You can drop the Mr. I think you've earned that." A smile flickered across her face. "Then you can call him by his name," she said, tilting her head toward the horse. "His name?" "Midnight." Hank repeated it quietly. "Midnight." He looked at the animal grazing under the sun, his black coat glinting with faint scars. "Fitting." She nodded. "He's not a monster. You just forgot how to listen." The word struck him harder than he expected. "Yeah," he murmured. "I did." For a while they stood there, two unlikely companions, watching the horse move in slow, deliberate circles. Hank broke the silence. The money's being transferred to the account Nora helped set up for you. Half of it's for your schooling, half for the horse. I didn't do it for the money. I know, but it's yours. Grace closed her notebook. Then I'll use it to fix what's broken. He frowned. The ranch? No, she said softly. People. Later that day, Hank called his foreman, Tucker, into the office. The man swaggered in, confident as ever, his boots leaving mud prints on the wooden floor. Heard you're paying the kid, he said with a grin. Guess that's good PR. Hank looked at him steadily. You hit that horse last week, didn't you? Tucker froze. What's it matter? I didn't ask for excuses. Hank's voice dropped lower, colder. You're done here. Take your things and leave. Tucker's grin vanished. You're firing me? After all you did, Hank interrupted. You think I didn't see what this place became? What I became? He stood, his shadow stretching across the floor. Get out before I forget I'm trying to change. The man stormed out, slamming the door. Hank sank back into his chair, the room suddenly lighter. That evening, as the sun began to dip behind the hills, he walked to the corral. Grace was gone, but Midnight remained, standing near the fence. Hank approached slowly, stopping a few feet away. The horse lifted his head, watching him. For a long moment they stared at each other, the old man and the animal that had carried every sin he'd ever committed. I don't expect forgiveness, Hank said quietly. But I'm sorry anyway. The horse's ears flicked forward. He didn't move away. Hank stood there until the light faded and the first stars appeared. That night, for the first time in decades, he didn't dream of rodeos or crowds or money. He dreamed of silence, of a wide field, a girl's laughter somewhere far away, and the sound of hooves against soft earth. Days passed. The ranch hands began repairing the fences, removing old chains, cleaning the stables. Nora oversaw everything with her usual dry humor, but there was something new in her tone, something almost hopeful. Grace continued visiting every day, her notebook filling with sketches and words. Hank watched from a distance, sometimes offering a wave, never interfering. One afternoon, he found her sitting under the same oak where his father had once taught him to rope calves. She was writing, sunlight dripping through the branches. What are you putting in there? He asked. She looked up. Everything that doesn't belong to me. Pain, fear, the past. He smiled faintly. And what do you keep? Hope, she said simply. He nodded. Good choice. The wind rustled the pages. Grace closed the book and looked toward the corral, where Midnight stood in the glow of the setting sun. He's healing, she said. Hank followed her gaze. So am I. It was true. The ranch felt different now, less like a monument to pride, more like a place where life might begin again. The wild energy that had once fueled him had turned to something quieter, humbler. That night, Hank sat alone on the porch. He thought about his son, wherever he was. He thought about Grace and the horse, and about how a child had shown him the cost of cruelty and the price of peace. The stars above Ash Hollow looked the same as they always had, but Hank knew the world beneath them had changed. He whispered into the dark, his voice almost lost to the wind. Maybe it's time I start listening too. Inside the barn, Midnight shifted in his stall, snorting softly, as if answering a question only the two of them could hear. Autumn arrived in Ash Hollow with the smell of rain and wood smoke. The air turned cooler, the sky stretching wide and pale above the open fields. The Cormac Ranch looked different now. The fences had been mended, the rusted chains removed, and the barns painted a clean shade of white that glowed softly in the morning sun. But what had changed most couldn't be painted or measured. It was the quiet. A peaceful quiet that replaced the sound of shouting, of engines, of pride. Grace Miller still came every day, walking, the familiar dirt road at dawn. She carried her notebook and a bag of apples, the same way she had on that first morning, though now her steps no longer hesitated. When she reached the corral, Midnight was already waiting, his black coat gleaming beneath the golden light. He trotted toward her, snorting softly, lowering his head until his muzzle brushed her shoulder. "Morning?" she whispered, her voice carrying through the crisp air. Hank watched from his porch, a mug of coffee steaming in his hands. Every morning, he told himself he wouldn't stand there watching, and every morning he did anyway. There was something about seeing that girl with the horse that steadied him in ways he didn't understand. She wasn't the same child who had first challenged him. There was more calm in her now, but also something older, like she'd touched the edge of the world and come back wiser. And Hank, he wasn't the same either. He still wore his hat low, still barked orders now and then, but he'd stopped yelling. He'd stopped pretending that fear and control were the same thing as respect. That morning, Grace leaned against the fence, writing. Hank could just make out her voice as she read aloud. "He's not tamed," she said. "He's just free." The words made something twist inside him. Maybe regret, maybe pride, maybe both. He walked down toward the corral, his boots crunching over gravel. Grace looked up and smiled faintly. "You're early," she said. "I could say the same." He nodded toward the notebook. "Still writing?" "Still learning." Hank rested his arms on the fence beside her. "What do you learn from a horse that won't talk back?" Grace didn't answer right away. She reached up to touch Midnight's mane, the black strands glinting in the light. "That silence says plenty," she finally said. "You just have to stop needing to be louder than it." He stared at her, realizing that in her simplicity she had said the one thing he'd spent 50 years avoiding. He looked at the horse, then back at her. "You ever think about what you'll do next?" She smiled. "Maybe I'll learn to help others heal the way he did. Nora says there's a program for students who want to study animal rehabilitation. She's helping me apply." "Good for you," Hank said. His voice caught slightly. "That's good." She tore an apple in half, handing one piece to him, one to the horse. "You should try being around him more," she said. "He doesn't bite unless you lie." He chuckled, a sound that still felt foreign on his tongue. "Then maybe I'll keep my distance." Grace laughed softly, and for a moment it sounded like something holy. Days passed into weeks. Reporters stopped calling. The story that had once trended everywhere faded into memory. The world moved on to the next headline, the next scandal, the next piece of noise. But at the ranch, time slowed again. Nora managed the new rescue, barn, where abandoned horses from nearby counties were brought for care. Hank donated land and money, but he refused to let anyone name it after him. "Let it belong to the animals," he said simply. Grace helped on weekends, tending to the new arrivals. She was quiet, patient, steady, the same way she'd been with Midnight. The horses responded to her in ways no one else could explain. One evening, Nora said, "You've got a gift, Grace. Whatever you do next, don't lose it." Grace smiled, brushing hay from her jeans. "It's not a gift," she said. "It's listening. Anyone can do it if they stop trying to be right all the time." That night, Hank walked out to the corral again. The moon hung low, silvering the fields. Midnight stood by the fence, half in shadow, half in light. Hank stepped closer, holding out a hand. The horse didn't flinch this time. His muzzle pressed gently against the old man's palm, warm and alive. Hank whispered, "You and that girl, you broke something in me I should have let break a long time ago." The horse's breath fogged in the cool air. Hank let his hand fall, but the feeling lingered. He looked up at the stars. "Maybe I'm the one being tamed," he said quietly. When Grace found him there the next morning, he didn't say anything. He just nodded toward midnight and said, "He lets me feed him now." She grinned. "Guess he decided you're worth trusting." "Guess so." A few days later, Nora came to the porch carrying an envelope. "Letter for you," she told Grace, "from the college in Bozeman." Grace's eyes widened. Her hands trembled as she tore it open. After a moment, she looked up, her voice barely a whisper. "They accepted me." Nora whooped, laughing. "Of course they did." Hank smiled. "Told you all that notebook scribbling would pay off." Grace shook her head. "It's not for me. It's for him," she said, glancing toward midnight. "Everything I learned came from him." When the day came for her to leave, the whole ranch gathered by the corral. The air was cold, breath turning to mist. Grace hugged Nora tightly. "Take care of them," she said. "Always." Then she turned to Hank. He looked older than she remembered, less like the man who had dared the world to beat him, and more like someone who had finally laid his armor down. "I don't know how to thank you," she said. He shook his head. "You already did. You made this place human again." She laughed softly. "Then I guess we're even." She walked toward midnight one last time. The horse stood waiting, his eyes deep and calm. She pressed her forehead against his, whispering something too quiet for anyone to hear. Then she stepped back. "Goodbye, boy," she said. He let out a low nicker, almost as if answering. Grace smiled through her tears and turned toward the road. The truck Nora had borrowed was waiting, engine humming. Hank watched her climb in and drive away, dust trailing behind until she was nothing but a shimmer in the distance. The ranch felt enormous without her. But it wasn't empty. The silence she left behind was the good kind, the kind that heals. Weeks later, Hank received a small package in the mail. Inside was a single page torn from Grace's notebook. On it, in her uneven handwriting, were 6 words. He wasn't tamed. He was forgiven. Hank read it 3 times, then folded it carefully and slipped it into his wallet. Every morning afterward, he carried it with him when he fed the horses. Winter came, and the land slept beneath snow. Midnight grew older, calmer, his scars fading into silver lines beneath his coat. Hank grew older too, but the sharpness in him softened. Some evenings he'd lean against the fence and look toward the horizon, whispering the girl's words under his breath like a prayer. He wasn't tamed, he'd say. He was forgiven. And sometimes, in the fading light, it felt like the world itself had forgiven him too. In time, visitors came to the ranch, school groups, travelers, families who had heard the story of the wild horse and the girl who rode without fear. They called it the Ash Hollow Sanctuary, though Hank never claimed the name. He only smiled when people asked about the horse. "He's free," he would say simply. And when they asked about the girl, he'd pause, eyes drifting to the far edge of the fields. "She listened," he'd answer. That's all she ever did. And somehow, it changed everything. As the sun set each evening, Hank would close the corral gate, his boots leaving prints beside midnights. The sky above the Montana plains glowed red and gold, the same color as the day it all began. And in that stillness, beneath the vast, forgiving sky, the world finally felt quiet again. No chains, no shouts, just peace. If this story touched your heart, tell me what you felt. Would you have done what Grace did? Leave a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you want to join me for more true, heartfelt stories like this one, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next journey.